In the light-hearted British cult classic Monty Python and the Holy Grail, King Arthur has a run-in with annoying Dennis the Peasant, who seems to know more about the government than he should.
Well, I am king. Oh, king, eh? Very nice. And how do you get that, eh? By exploiting the workers. By hanging on to outdated imperialist dogma which perpetuates the economic and social differences in our society.
I didn't know we had a king. I thought we were an autonomous collective.
You're fooling yourself. We're living in a dictatorship. A self-perpetuating autocracy in which the working classes...
Oh, there you go, bringing class into it again.
Well, that's what it's all about.
Don't have a lord.
What? I told you. We're an anarcho-syndicalist commune. We take it in turns to act as a sort of executive officer for the week.
Yes.
But all the decisions of that officer have to be ratified at a special bi-weekly meeting.
Yes, I see.
By a simple majority in the case of purely internal affairs.
Be quiet.
But by a two-thirds majority in the case of more...
Be quiet. I order you to be quiet.
Order, who does he think he is?
I'm your king.
Well, I didn't vote for you.
Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony.
Shut up! Will you shut up?
Ah, now we see the violence inherent in the system.
Shut up!
Oh, come and see the violence inherent in the system. Help, help, I'm being repressed.
Bloody peasant!
Oh, what a giveaway. Did you hear that? Did you hear that, eh? That's what I'm on about. Did you see him repressing me? You saw it, didn't
Though this movie was intended as a mere parody of popular video game scenarios, this scene evokes some serious questions. Did Dennis the Peasant have a point, and what really were the roles and rights of the lower classes in Europe? The lower class in feudal Europe was populated by peasants and serfs, and they had their own characteristics, customs, and culture just like any other social class. The underlying difference between the two regarded laws against movement. Serfs had more restrictions placed on them, and since they were tied to their manor, they couldn't leave like peasants could. However, there is a gray area between the two filled with oppressed peasants and serfs with comparatively good living conditions. European peasants in the Middle Ages were all classified under one image, possessing tenants, meaning they could occupy land that was rented from a landlord, who farmed their land with family labor and lived in a nuclear household, which is a set of parents along with any number of its offspring. Peasants farmed their lands in a cyclical process determined by the seasons. In the spring, summer crops were planted, animals were put out to graze in pastures, and cow's milk was used to make cheese and butter for consumption. Summer was marked by cutting hay in the meadows and shearing wool off sheep. And autumn was harvest time, therefore always the busiest. Plowing the fields, planting spring crops, slaughtering livestock, and preserving the meat by salting or smoking were all activities reserved for the wintertime. Like most everything, there is more to the story than the idyllic life of farming in the countryside. Due to the hierarchy of feudalism and lack of legal protection, lords often took advantage of peasants. The Grievances of Rural Subjects, published by peasants of Kempton, Swabia in 1492, provided a glimpse into universal lord and peasant relations. The abbot in Kempton was accused of levying new taxes, trying to tie the peasants to their land like serfs, interfering with inheritance customs, and restricting interactions with outsiders, including marriage, land purchases, and livestock purchases. Issues such as these were the motivation behind the German Peasants' Revolt. This revolt, also known as the German Peasants' War, was a culmination of previous smaller uprisings. The peasantry and poorer classes united behind the 12 Articles of Peasantry: the liberty to choose their own pastors, relief from the lesserties, abolition of serfdom, the right to fish and hunt, restoration of enclosed common lands, abolition of death duties, impartiality of the courts, and restriction of the demands of landlords to just their feudal dues. However, the outspoken Martin Luther, whose teachings were the core of Lutheranism, quickly denounced the revolt on the basis of three reasons. Reason 1. Peasants had sworn to their true and gracious rulers to be submissive and obedient, but since they had deliberately and sacrilegiously abandoned their obedience, and in addition have dared to oppose their lords, they have thereby forfeited body and soul as perfidious, perjured, lying, disobedient wretches and scoundrels are wont to do. Reason 2. Peasants cause uproar and sacrilegiously rob and pillage monasteries and castles that do not belong to them. And reason 3, they cloak their frightful and revolting sins with the gospel, call themselves Christian brethren, swear allegiance, and compel people to join them in such abominations. Luther's strong condemnation was quickly followed by an end to the German Peasants' War. This situation gave light to all those opposing improvement to peasant rights, as well as the drastic imbalance of power between social classes. One man of higher standing, without eating up a weapon, had stopped hundreds of thousands of determined peasants. With a death toll of roughly anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000, the German Peasants' War also served as a warning to those seeking to gain more rights for the lower classes. So what happened to the serfs of Europe? Though their history to this point closely resembled that of the peasantry, the High Middle Ages marked a distinctive divide regarding serfdom in Europe. Eastern European serfdom was more recent, oppressive, and widespread than in Western Europe. And in the East, serfdom was generally enforced by government decrees forbidding the movement versus individual policies implemented by lords. Thus, by the beginning of the 16th century in the West, serfdom had been effectively disarmed and was no longer a status of legal bondage. Comparatively, serfdom in Eastern Europe only intensified, largely because of the frequency of demanding work and lack of legal protection, as well as the burden of newly introduced state taxations. This came to be known as Second Serfdom and was thought to have been a reflection of Eastern Europe's underdevelopment in comparison to Western Europe. Even though serfdom lasted much longer in Eastern than in Western Europe, the early modern period saw progress come with time. During the 17th century, serfdom began to be viewed as a personal disability with degrading connotations. Then, the abolition of serfdom occurred over the course of the 19th century, starting with Prussia, then Hungary, and Russia. Serfdom was abolished in Russia by Alexander II's Emancipation Manifesto. This speech was given in St. Petersburg in March 1861, the year of grace. In his speech, Alexander II declared that serfs and nobles can share land while serfs fulfill their obligations. The serfs could then purchase the land from the nobles and essentially own their property. This event was monumental for the history of serfs, who weren't even legally allowed to leave their land, much less own it. Much like European serfs, the peasants saw drastic changes as well as strides to improve their way of life. Peasants began to have more secure rights of tenancy, including a more concrete exchange of ownership as determined by inheritance specifications. However, the overall land available for peasants to farm began to decrease as it was given back to the government, sold to the aristocracy, and much more. So there was one step forward, then one step back. The shrinking of land gave peasants no other option than to leave the countryside and go find work as manual laborers. This forceful transition phased out the traditional peasant image and was instead retouched to reflect the changing perceptions. This replacement transpired as peasants began to try alternatives to farming, such as rural crafts or petty dealing. These crafts were the beginning of the putting out system. In this system, peasant families were provided raw materials that they turned into finished products and sent back to the dealer. This system was widely used to make textiles. Incorporation of this cottage industry into the daily life of peasants in the key areas of Europe helped modify the mindset for the adjustments toward modern day. The Industrial Revolution is an example of these adjustments, where peasants play their own essential part of advancement. Though their everyday life was changing, the existing structure of peasant society remained unaltered. It can be argued that such diversification provided the very safety valve that allowed traditional peasant social structures to survive. This unwavering structure of the lower class helped steady Europe during precarious times and provided a backbone upon which to build modern day. So Dennis the annoying peasant had his points. However, Dennis had only a small window with which to see the big picture of the lower class.